Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight for our chapter meeting. It's dedicated to rising sea levels or raising sea levels, actually rising sea levels, and New York City's response. And while we're waiting for others to join the meeting, we're going to get started with a few announcements. So we're going to replace that awkward few minutes at the beginning of the presentation with just a few announcements. So in the great news department, I just wanted to highlight that we now have over 1,000 chapter members. And this is a great achievement. And these are 1,000 dedicated activists that are united in our mission to educate and mobilize New Yorkers to take urgent climate action across every level of society. So if you'd like to get more involved in our education and advocacy and programming efforts, please let us know by dropping us a line. And Deepa, if you could drop the link for our chapter email in the chat, that would be super. And our second announcement is that about the electrification educator program that we're about to embark on. So Climate Reality was founded by the former Vice President Al Gore with the mission to educate about the causes and solutions to the climate crisis. At our last training, the focus of our education activities changed from from our general education activities to helping Americans take advantage of the IRA incentives to electrify their homes, transport, as well as source green electricity. So here in New York, the state and our utilities offer additional incentives, some of which are greater than the federal ones. So we've incorporated all of that into our materials, and we really feel like this is a turning point. We lobbied hard to get the right policy and environment to decarbonize our lives, and now we have it. So now our focus is really going to go to accelerating this process by helping people take advantage of those incentives. So, and the sum of all our individual actions will make a big difference, because the sooner that we take these actions, the better. Lastly, a group of the state coalition got together and made a set of materials, both presentations and tabling materials for any events that you might be invited to. These materials are available, and we're going to have a session on August 17th at 7 p.m. And Deepa, again, if you could drop the link in the chat, that would be super. This session, you'll see all of those materials. You'll be able to use them for decarbonizing your own life, but also if you want to become an electrification educator and reach out to different organizations like the Rotary and the state fairs and so on. So that's a great, that's a big announcement for all of us, because we put a lot of effort and a lot of time into that, and it's super, it's really good. Everyone who's seen it is really excited about it. So we encourage you to join us on August 17th. Okay, so I think we've got I think most people have now filtered into the meeting, so we'll get started. And with that, I would actually like to pass it over to Beth to make the introductions. But before I do, I just wanted to highlight that the intention of tonight's meeting, and the topic of tonight's meeting, is about the sea level rise and the threat that it poses to our city, New York City, as well as the city's responses and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers planned responses to that threat. So this is very much an educational meeting tonight, and we will be having at the end of the presentations an extended Q&A session so that everyone can get their questions in and hopefully get some answers in. So with that, I will now hand it over to Beth. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Paul. Good evening, everyone. I'm Beth Quiros. Paul went through what we're going to be talking about tonight, but we have speakers joining us from Columbia University, the Mayor's Office, as well as the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. As Paul mentioned, please put any questions you have in the chat. Faith and Deepa are going to be monitoring those, and we'll bring those to the attention of our speakers at the end of the speaker presentations. And so with that, we're going to get started. We've got a lot to cover. So our first speaker is from Columbia University. Dr. Jacqueline Austermann is an associate professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. She's going to be sharing her work on estimates for sea level rise based on her work with paleoclimate data. So with that, welcome. And I'm going to pass it to Dr. Austermann.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thanks everyone for organizing this event and giving us a platform to share our work. Let me share my screen here.
The thing is
this
I've just signed on to this thing. I think we're going to have to just listen to it's a really in-depth. It's just going to destroy the evening.
Okay.
You know what I mean? There won't be any way
Someone
we
might
can
have to
all actually
mute,
take
sorry.
it in.
Someone might have to
We're
mute.
doing like a presentation.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, so does my slide show up okay on the screen? Okay, perfect. So again, thank you so much for putting this event together and for everyone participating today and allowing us to kind of speak about the work that we do. So as Beth was saying, I'm Jackie Austermann. I'm a professor at Columbia University, and my work is on studying how sea level is changing. I think mostly about how sea level is changing in the past over hundreds and thousands and millions of years. But all of that work that we do in the past is really targeted at better understanding what happens today and what happens in the future. So I'm really excited to spend a little bit of time today on that aspect. And I will particularly focus on New York City, of course, since this is the topic of today's meeting. So what I want to do, let me just make my participants small here. What I want to do is I want to cover the science, and I want to give you the main things to know when you think about how a city should plan for future sea level rise, and specifically for New York. And the way that I think about this is that I really think about the threat of sea level changing and sea level rising in two categories that have similar but maybe differing responses. One is sort of the slowly rising sea level change that leads to tidal and nuisance flooding. And the other is temporary large events, storm and sea level events that happen during major storms. And I'll talk about those two kind of categories. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first one here. I'm going to start with the data. I'm going to start with what we see if we measure sea level. And sea level in New York has been measured for a long time. You see on the x-axis here on the bottom time, 1875 up to, I pulled this from the web yesterday, I believe. So it's up to 2023. This is from a tide gauge station, so a station that measures sea level. On the y-axis here is sea level in millimeters, and it's a station at Battery Park. So next time you're down in the Battery, have a look out for this little white shack. This is where sea level data are collected for New York City. So in New York City, sea level has risen by about 20 inches or 50 centimeters since 1860. And that sea level rise has accelerated since about 1993, but really it's overall sort of accelerating here over time. The current rate of sea level rise is about 4.5 millimeters per year. So that's about 0.2 inches per year. That rate is over the last 20, 30 years or so. If you were to look at just even more recent times, it might even be faster because that rate is accelerating. So it gives you a sense, half a centimeter per year is the rate of sea level rise currently. Now, how does that compare to other places around the world? And that's actually an interesting and not trivially to answer question, because sea level globally varies from one place to the next. All of these different arrows here show you how much, if at all, sea level is going up. In many places, you will see arrows that are blue where sea level is going down, or red where sea level is rising even more than in other places. And so there's spatially varying trends in sea level. And that's something that's really important to keep in mind when thinking about a sea level response from one city to the next. New Orleans will potentially have a very different sea level response because different factors cause a different amount of sea level rise there. And I'll talk about the main ones that are relevant for New York, and I can talk about the other ones if there are questions at the end. So also global mean sea level. So global mean sea level is rising by about 3.5 millimeters per year, so slightly less than what we see in New York. And also the global mean sea level rise is accelerating. So where does that sea level rise come from? Today, it's actually broad stroke kind of broken down into three contributions: the global mean rise that's experienced, About a third comes from ice sheets melting. So this is off that 3.5 millimeters per year. So about a third of melt comes from the major ice sheets melting, so the Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet. About another third comes from glaciers melting, Alaska, Patagonia, Russia, Himalaya. And then another third comes from thermal expansion. So the ocean's getting warmer, the water expanding, and that drives about a third of the remaining sea level rise. In New York City, we have another third contribution that drives sea level rise, and that's the land subsiding. And that's why sea level rise in New York City is larger than in many other places, because we have about 1 millimeter or a little bit more per year of land subsidence. So if you're standing on the shoreline, it doesn't really matter whether the water goes up or the land goes down, both of it manifests itself in sea level rise. And then for New York, this is happening due to effects related to the last ice age that I won't go into, but I'm happy to answer questions on. And that contribution is baked in. So even if there wasn't any ice melt, that sea level would be rising in New York City today. If we look out into the future and sort of the time horizon, I'll keep in mind throughout the rest of the presentation, it's going to be until the end of the century. We'll continue to experience thermal expansion effects on sea level as temperatures continue to warm. Of course, the exact amounts of that will depend on emission pathways. Glaciers will continue to melt. They will potentially start to max out somewhere at the end of the century. And then really what's currently happening is that these major ice sheets are starting to take over and start to become a much bigger contribution to the overall budget, potentially by the end of the century. And because they have so much more capacity, there's just so much more water tied up in the ice sheet. So for example, the Greenland ice sheet, if it melted today, sea level would rise by about 7 meters. If the Antarctic ice sheet melted today, sea level would rise by about 60 meters. So there's just a lot of ice on that continent. So even if a small part of it melts, it has the potential to raise sea level quite a bit. So Antarctica and Greenland are the parts I really worry about for like the big magnitude changes in sea level in the future. And so this here, again, back to the data, shows you a little bit of what part of Antarctica is melting. So this is the Antarctic ice sheet here on the right. This is a time series. Don't worry too much about the details here, but areas that are red are areas that are melting and have been melting in the past. Areas in blue are actually areas where the ice sheet is gaining in mass. It's not a black and white, everything is collapsing and melting. Some areas of the Antarctic ice sheet are actually gaining mass, but big areas are melting. This is the Thwaites Glacier region, Pine Island Glacier, the Antarctic Peninsula. Those are some of the places that you often see in the news where a lot of the current mass loss is happening. And the big concern in Antarctica is that big parts of West Antarctica, which is really this part here, will start to become unstable and start to melt. And that's some of the very big questions in our fields. At what threshold, at what point will that happen? Because it would contribute to significant amounts of sea level rise. So let me go on here. So what do these projections look like for New York City specifically? I'm going to show you these projections in time again. We're from 1900 up to about today. This is from the NPCC report, so the New York City Panel on Climate Change report from 2019. So the data is slightly older, but this is the same tide gauge record from Battery Park. So this is the observed change in sea level. We have sea level change in feet here, if that is your preferred metric, or in meters here on the other axis, if you prefer that. And we're going to look at projections here up to the end of the century. So projections here are shown by these funny boxes with whiskers. So all that says really is that projections are likely within that solid box, and a little less likely, but still possible within those sort of whiskers up and down. So what do we, let me go back here. So what do we see? So projections, and here you see this paper is from 2019, or the studies from 2019, so it includes still the 2020s in here, but then 2050s, we're going up to a foot or so on average. In the 2080s, it's more between 2 and 3 feet, but up to 4 to 5 feet. And then by 2100, we have kind of a large range of uncertainty here. So the constraints aren't Great, and I should say, I have this on the next slide as well, I should highlight here that part of this uncertainty, part of this big range is, of course, some of this is, there are parts in their system we don't fully understand yet. But a part of this uncertainty is also dependent on us, what we do as a society in terms of emissions, how much we warm up the atmosphere. So uncertainty is both of those uncertainties are sort of baked into these predictions. And then in this report specifically, they and also in the most recent IPCC report, they point out these high and low probability sea level rise scenarios. So by 2100, a sea level rise scenario of about 9 to 10 feet. These scenarios are tied directly to what the Antarctic ice sheet is doing, and it ties to what I was just mentioning about uncertainty about when parts of that ice sheet is going to collapse. We're not fully clear where that threshold is. If it happens earlier, sea level could be rising a lot quicker. If the Antarctic ice sheet is a little more stable, we're probably looking more at these lower, still significant amounts of sea level rise, but maybe not in these highest scenarios here. And we don't even understand the probability of these happening super well, which is why they are just termed kind of low probability scenarios. And the uncertainties, as I mentioned, include emission pathways. So if emissions occur rapidly, we would expect to be at the lower end of these predictions. So what do these numbers mean for New York City? This shows you here sort of in the greens, we're within a meter. In the yellow to oranges, we're within 2 meters. And in the reds, we are up into 3 meters. So it gives you a sense of what areas of New York City and the surrounding area are most susceptible to sea level rise. And I've just kind of put those bars from the previous slide onto the same axis here. So it gives you a sense of what areas, as you move into the green, into the yellows, and into the reds, might get flooded into in the future. Now, one aspect to keep in mind here is that a lot of these regions, sea level is not a constant level, even though it's called sea level. But rather, of course, we know that we have tides that happen daily. So in a lot of these places, sea level is already going up and down, and it's going up and down significantly, right? So in the Battery, the tidal range, so from high tide to low tide, it's 4.5 feet. Jamaica Bay, it's about 6 feet. So it's not like these places are currently always above sea level. They are already being flooded in part depending on the tides. But as sea level is rising, that high tide is shifted higher and higher. And that's when nuisance flooding, which is the minor and recurring flooding that takes place at high tide, becomes more and more frequent. So it currently occurs several times per year, but the frequencies of that has already doubled over the last 60 years, and it's believed to be linked to the sea level rise, and that will continue to increase. So really, if we are thinking about sea level, the sort of slow creeping up of sea level, what we'll see in practice is going to be more and more frequent, like this flooding during high tide levels of these areas that are particularly low-lying. Now, I want to spend the rest. So this is sort of slowly rising sea level. On the other end of the spectrum, we have storm surges. And storm surges happen when major storms like hurricanes come through, and they actually exert a pressure on the water and stresses on the water, so on the ocean, and they pile up water close to the coast. So there's a wind-driven surge and a pressure-driven surge as the hurricane comes through. So a storm surge is the rising of the sea as a result of wind and atmospheric pressure changes associated with a storm. Now, these have much higher magnitudes. And this just kind of zooming out here for a second, just to always keep in mind, of course, we focus on New York, but a lot of these risks do apply to a lot of places along the Atlantic seaboard and the Gulf of Mexico. So this shows you areas feet above ground, 1 foot, 3 feet, 6 feet, 9 feet, areas that are particularly vulnerable. And if we think about 6 feet, 9 feet to, already today, storm surges, I'll show you kind of what expected ranges we see for storms coming through. When that storm surge happens during high tide, it's referred to as the storm tide. So it's a storm surge is exacerbated when coinciding with a high tide. Of course, New York City experienced this in 2012 during Hurricane Sandy. The storm tide was above 11 feet. So this is higher than any of the sea level predictions that I talked for the end of the century that I told you about before, but it's temporary, right? It's here for reference. This paper here picks out a few of the key landmarks and their elevations and areas that were flooded. And of course, during Sandy specifically, the part of the subway system was flooded, and there's sort of a threshold behavior in the infrastructure as well, where if sea level is just below the subway entrance, damage might be manageable. If it's just above, it's exponentially worse. So as sea level rises, so does the storm tide. So here, what I'm showing you is sort of the return period and the storm tide that we expect, or that we are observing in New York City. So about every year, we see a storm that comes up to 4 or 5 feet. Every 10 years, we see a storm that comes up to 6, 7 feet. Every 100 years, it's maybe up to 11, 12. And every 500 years, we see a storm that is between 10 to 15 meters in the storm tide. Hurricane Sandy, as I said before, is just above 11 feet. So sort of at that margin between 100 and 500 year flood. These are the values here just for reference that I used by FEMA for insurance purposes. What this doesn't include is that in addition to these reoccurrence intervals, sea level is also going to rise in the future. And if I'm just going to throw these predictions on the higher end scenarios here, so this is for 2020s, 2050s, 2080, 2100. So at 2100, a 100-year storm will actually have a storm tide of not 11 foot, but probably 14 or 15 feet. And these are, we'll hear from the city in a moment, but I imagine these are the heights where really that are not necessarily currently, or are much more difficult for the city to deal with than if we're looking at just a few feet. Similarly, at the 500-year flood will happen at higher and will cause higher and higher sea level, temporary sea levels. There's also a question whether storms become more frequent, and that's more difficult to predict. And projections there are still varying what that means for New York City. So what the rising sea level together with a storm tide means that by 2100, what we would call today a 100-year flood will actually happen every 5 to 50 years. And what we would call a 500-year flood would happen every 25 to 250 years. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm just going to summarize what I think are sort of the critical points that we need to keep in mind when thinking about a city's response. And that's that there are sort of these two end-member sea level rise scenarios that are going on at the same time, which is a slowly rising sea level, about 4.5 millimeters per year. The amount of that will depend on both human action, but also majorly so on major ice sheets and how stable and unstable they are. It's going to be a slow but steady sea level rise. It will increase nuisance flooding, and we're pretty much baked in. This is going to happen for sure. Even if emissions are curbed, sea level is going to rise 100% in New York City. On the other end, but magnitudes might be, some people might consider small, half a centimeter per year. On the other hand, we have these events that are temporary but extreme in magnitude. So storms coming through that cause extreme sea levels, they are large in magnitude but temporary. And as sea level rises, if we have the combination of those two effects, these storms and storm surges, the impact of these becomes more severe. Okay, I'm gonna stop here. I'm gonna pass it on to the next speaker. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm excited to answer questions at the end. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Austermann. All right. Our second speaker is Cherry Mui. She is a senior policy advisor with the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. She's going to be providing an overview of the city's coastal resiliency portfolio and plans. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Mui.
Thank you, Beth. Share my screen. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting us to present our work. Just a quick intro on what the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice are. We're a team of architects, lawyers, data and climate scientists, engineers, policy advisors, and city planners that are leading the city's climate strategy and agenda. We make our buildings more efficient and resilient, ensure that our infrastructure is climate ready, transforming our streets and public realm into living open spaces that make our energy more clean and resilient. Through science-based analysis, policy and program development, and capacity building with a focus on equity and health, we lead the city's efforts to ensure that the city is both reducing its carbon emissions and preparing and adapting our city to the climate threats that we're experiencing now. So here's just a quick overview. I'm going to provide of the city's climate strategic plan that was recently released back in April during Earth Week, and then zoom into some of the flood resiliency initiatives that we've been working on or embarking on in the next couple of years. The action plan or Plan NYC, Getting Sustainability Done, it's both a resiliency and sustainability plan that it's implementing bold, equitable, long-term policies with near-term benefits. We're leveraging private sector investment with a strategic carrot and sticks approach. And there are three pillars to this. The first is protecting us from climate threats, everything from extreme heat to flooding in the coastal and stormwater resilience space, to making our buildings more resilient and sustainable, and our energy grid more resilient energy and sustainable. Improving our quality of life, that includes open spaces and waterways, transportation and food. And then the third pillar is embracing a green economy and a waste and circular economy. And within the protecting us from climate threats, there's three large initiatives that are really focused on the coastal piece for the topic of conversation today. So the first is creating a new leadership structure in 2023 for coastal resilience, headed by the Department of Environmental Protection. This is important because from the public's perspective, when people think about flooding, they're not asking, is it coming from the sky or is it coming from the ocean? They want a one place to just, get their information from. And this is one way of doing that. With this new structure, governance structure, flooding needs will be considered holistically due to the compounding risk, right? There's the interaction of coastal resilience and interior drainage. Assigning this new leadership responsibility to one agency will unify the long-term planning and funding, increases the coordination and efficiency, and improve the maintenance of flood resilience projects. And then also, with DEP, they'll continue their partnerships with a wide variety of agencies that have oversight or jurisdiction of the waterfront sites. The second initiative within the climate threats pillar is, there's several work streams that come out of that. First is developing a minimum flood resilience standard for shoreline assets by 2026. Currently, we don't have a standard or set of standards for our shoreline assets like bulkheads and piers. So we are planning to scope that out and analyze that and figure that out. And we're going to look at, lessons learned from other municipalities that have done this across the country and across the world. And then also continue to design and construct the world-class neighborhood coastal protection projects, and also, partner and continue partnering with the Corps on the New York, New Jersey harbor and tributary study that both Bryce and Danielle will present on after my presentation. Here's just a quick map of some of the coastal protection projects that are underway. It provides different levels of protection, everything from what Jackie had talked about, which is the large storm surge levels, with like Hurricane Sandy, to the more regular nuisance tidal flooding that we're experiencing on a daily basis in some of these very low-lying areas in New York City. And these are just some of the approaches, how we're going about with any of these coastal protection projects. It's that we need to prioritize the most vulnerable populations. We have to plan for future risk, as Jackie had talked about, sea levels, rising into the future. Those storm surges are going to also be higher. Those water levels will be higher. So we need to be planning for that. Take a very tailored community by community approach, because it's not a one size fits all. A project that works in the East Side, Lower Manhattan does not necessarily work in an area like Red Hook in Brooklyn. And part of that is also conducting that really robust engagement, more than your typical like capital project, like a road work, reconstruction, because these types of assets, they're going to be there for generations, and they're going to alter our waterfront, right? So there's a lot of engagement that has to take place with the stakeholders in the local level. And part of also that is communicating that trade-offs, right? If you want a higher level of protection, there's a possibility, based on the site constraints, that has to be a flood wall. You might, it might block your access to the waterfront. You might lose those views, right? Or a lower level of protection, where you might have those lower walls, or you have like nature-based solutions, but it doesn't provide you with the same level of protection as a flood wall or a surge barrier would. And then because these are really, really expensive investments, the city can't do this on their own, right? So we really need to maximize the federal investments that are out there. So, the IIJA funds, the IRA funds, and then, with this Army Corps study, that is, unlocking additional federal funds for these type of investments. While this isn't an initiative coming out of Plan NYC, I just wanted to highlight a few things for you on the city's approach. It's a multi-layered, multi-scale approach, right? In addition to coastal protection projects or coastal resiliency for our 520 miles of coastline, it covers, that obviously covers several neighborhoods, but these particular initiatives, make our developments and our buildings more resilient in the flood hazard areas through zoning, asset and building level approaches. For one, special coastal districts were created in 2017 to address coastal areas that are currently at exceptional risk from flooding and may face greater risk in the future. The special districts place limits on new developments in these highly vulnerable areas and ensure that development is consistent with open space and infrastructure plans. The text amendment adopted in 2021 by City Council allows for homeowners, architects, and others to design resilient buildings that are better protected and withstand from flood risk and reduce flood insurance cost. It protects also, it protects and supports public access to our waterfront through resilient open space design. Through our building code, Appendix G, we have one of the country's most stringent building codes for developments in the coastal flood hazard areas and have been, proven to be very effective and resiliency measure. And then last, the climate resiliency design guidelines, or CRDG, We're building resiliency into everything we do as a city, and this includes preparing for impacts of inland flooding, extreme heat, in addition to coastal storms like Sandy and the tidal flooding that we experience regularly in some of these low-lying areas. We're moving towards incorporating climate risk into every major capital project that the city is taking through the local law 41 that was enacted in 2021. And then, this is thanks, in great partnership to the city council leadership, of local law 122. They're also advancing a climate adaptation strategy. The pilot of these like CRDG projects are well underway. There's a dozen of them or so, and they're using the forward-looking climate standards. And then just to mention, the different city agencies like Parks Department and Department of Environmental Protection also have, developed resiliency plans for their assets. And then the third initiative is launch a voluntary housing mobility and land acquisition program, right? We currently have $1 million of HUD CDBGDR funding from the Ida storm that is going to be used to figure out what this program is going to look like. But this is a very more people, human-centric approach, right? This is not just about acquiring land. It's about providing the homeowners and renters with financial counseling, housing counseling, and estate planning services to prepare them for their future moves, right? It's part of this program is going to be prioritize areas with flood risk exposure to not just chronic flooding, but also coastal surge flooding and stormwater flooding. On the acquisition side of that is like, what do you do with after, you acquire these land, these properties and you have this land, right? We're going to figure out how to convert these acquired properties to resilient and sustainable end uses. And a big part of this program is that it needs to be flexible and allow for a program to be scaled up after a major flood event. And then again, leveraging that federal funding opportunities to support this program. And that is all I have. Now I'm going to turn it over to the next speakers.
Thank you so much, Terry. We appreciate it. I'm going to introduce our third and fourth speaker. They are both from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the New York District Planning Division. So first, there is Danielle Tommaso. She is a Senior Plan Formulator, and she's managing large-scale coastal storm management and flood risk management studies in New York and New Jersey. And then I'll go ahead and introduce Bryce Wisemiller as well. He is a project manager, and he leads teams that study, design, and construct federal resilience infrastructure throughout the New York metro area. So thank you both for being with us.
Great, and thank you so much for having us and inviting us tonight. We do have a short presentation. I am going to start sharing my screen. Excellent, hopefully everybody can see the presentation. So, Cherry spoke a little bit about this study that Bryce and I are going to talk about for the next 20 minutes. It's called the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Tributary Study. Or HATS for short. You'll hear Bryce and I using that acronym throughout. I'll just say it's a very interesting, complex, large-scale study. Again, Bryce and I are only going to talk for about 20 minutes tonight. If you want to learn more about the study and generally about the Army Corps' work, please check us out online. This is our study website, and on it you could find links to GIS-based story map. You could find summary guides. You could find, here is a snapshot of the website on the left-hand side of the page. If you want to know the detail of what Bryce and I are just going to scratch the surface on tonight, check out the links on the left-hand side that link you to the draft integrated feasibility report and Tier 1 EIS. That's probably your best resource, again, for all the details of what we're going to talk about tonight. So I'll just give a quick overview of the study, and then Bryce is going to dive into the details. So Cherry talked a lot about flooding in our community in the New York City metro area, and specifically Hurricane Sandy. And that's really the genesis of the HAT study. As we heard from Jackie and Cherry, you know, our area experiences flooding from all sorts of sources, from the sky and the sea. I like how you said that, Cherry. This study, the HAT study, focuses mostly on coastal storm risk management. So that's flooding from coastal storms such as nor'easters and hurricanes. That's within the Army Corps' purview and mission to look at. Remember, we're just one of many federal agencies that investigates federal infrastructure projects. And so we're just, like what Cherry was saying, the federal government is just a piece of the pie when it comes to funding and authorization. And the Army Corps is just one of many federal agencies that's been working in our area. So the HAT study, again, the genesis of it was Hurricane Sandy in 2012. The Army Corps investigated the entire Atlantic coast after that storm to look at areas that we haven't yet investigated or recommended large infrastructure projects. And the New York City metro area generally was one of those areas. So we began this study back in 2016, and it's being done in partnership with the state of New York, the state of New Jersey, and the city of New York, represented by Cherry's agency, the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. The study area, so the area that we're looking at through this study, includes areas that are tidally influenced within the New York City metro area. So that includes all of New York City, parts of northern New Jersey, as you could see on the map, all the tributaries that run into New York Harbor from northern New Jersey, and also parts of Rockland County, Westchester County, and then moving up the Hudson River, because as we know, the Hudson River is tidally influenced to the Troy Lock and Dam. So we're actually looking at flooding all up and down the Hudson through just north of Albany. Right now, just a snapshot of where we're at. We're in the middle of the study phase, and Bryce will tell you more about that and the details about where exactly we are. I'll talk about schedule later, but we're going to complete the study at the earliest next year. We'll talk more about schedule later and process and how you could plug into it. So maybe that's a good segue for Bryce to start telling us about the details.
Thank you, Danielle. So yeah, our schedule is kind of up in the air. Just so everybody knows, we are kind of discussing that with our vertical team as we get to our what we refer to as the agency decision milestone. But as it is right now, with the various things that have occurred on the study, the extended public outreach and such, we are anticipating a extension on the study schedule, maybe on the study funding as well. But those are details not yet worked out within our agency. So the alternatives that we've been evaluating for the past several years have been very comprehensive for the area and very, very different from each other. At one end of the spectrum, there are very large in-water measures, particularly storm surge barriers, similar to what's been done in a number of other locations, both nationally and internationally, more notably. Rotterdam, St. Petersburg, and such have very large storm surge barriers at the entrances to their harbor areas. So that's at one end of the spectrum. And then we have a series of kind of hybrid alternatives, alternative 3A, 3B, and 4, that are all described in that draft report that's on the website that Danielle showed. The report itself is like 500 pages. There is a reader's guide to kind of guide you through that. And then there's like 3,500 pages of appendices. So there is a wealth of information. So please believe me that the presentation that we're showing now is just a very scratch of the surface from what is contained within this report. So those three alternatives in the middle have all been the best performing economically through our evaluations. And it actually was alternative 3B, that one there in the middle, that based on our analysis and consideration of all factors at the time, was the one that we had tentatively selected and identified in that draft report that was released in September of last year. At the other end of the spectrum, just to continue it, are only land-based measures. So these middle three alternatives are combinations of land-based measures and storm surge barriers at various locations, geographic sites within the harbor where we think they might be feasible or possible for addressing long stretches of shoreline from storm surge, exacerbated by sea level rise, of course, going out into the future. So whatever plan does get advanced, we have not made decisions on that yet, but whatever plan is advanced, there's a lot more details left to be worked out in the plan. What we have now is really kind of a framework of a plan. There's a lot of natural and nature-based features that we're looking to add into the plan, along with additional non-structural measures. But we see whatever plan does get advanced will be a layered plan in terms of trying to have different approaches for different areas, as well as maybe possibly multiple approaches for one area or another. So it's fairly complex, the plan that we have. And we see, because of that, the implementation probably being something that's done in a phased implementation, where the components that are more easily implemented more quickly are done in the short term. Those that need more evaluation and design take a little bit longer for that, and then construct those in the midterm. And then whatever's put in place is important, given the uncertainty that is associated with sea level rise going out into the longer term future, that everything is adaptable, into the future, not only during the economic period where we do our evaluations for, well, economics, but then also the planning horizon, which for our study goes out a century basically from when the project would be completed in construction. So we do have a fairly long time period for looking at those future adaptations. Next slide, please, Daniel. So alternative one, just to point out, is basically our base analysis of what the future will hold without anything coming out from the study. So we refer to that as a future without project condition. And within that, we take into account a number of different factors, many of which are variable and are subject to change over time. The one thing that we have been looking at, just because this study was born out of Hurricane Sandy, a fairly severe storm for the area, as everyone knows. So we've been looking at primarily trying to address coastal flood risk for the area, for what we refer to as that 1% flood event, otherwise known as that 100-year storm event, with intermediate relative sea level change added to that projection. So the graph shown on the left on this slide basically shows the area that would be inundated from that storm event over that area, again, with intermediate sea level rise attached to it. Now, that's not the same water level in this, because some areas have greater risk than others for having that same probability event. So everybody has the same chance of flooding as shown on this graphic, but the water level that floods into the areas are different because the risk profile is different over the geographic area, given that it is such a vast study area. Another thing that we take into account, which is kind of a bit of a mirror of what Cherry had showed, was some of the other projects that have and are being put in place. The graphic that's on the upper right. Basically, those are large shoreline-based projects that the Corps or the city or others have been putting in place in the area to address coastal storm risk. And that's a moving target. And in addition to this, there are literally dozens and dozens of additional very focused facility-specific resiliency and risk management measures that have been put in place since Hurricane Sandy, which we're also trying to track, primarily so that we don't count the damages that our features might avoid from what the damages that these projects are meant to avoid, so we don't double count benefits. So we get a good apple-to-apple comparison between the various alternatives that we've been considering and what the future holds without anything coming out from the study, alternative one. And then, of course, sea level rise is by far the greatest variable and uncertainty going out into the longer term future. The graphic that's on the lower right basically shows the Corps' high, intermediate, and low projections for the battery. We actually have projections also for Sandy Hook as well as Kings Point. Again, the study area is so vast, but we've been using the battery as a common comparison point for the different evaluations that we've been doing. So the dots that are on there are actually the two states and the city's projections over that time period, and they have assigned probabilities to their various projections. And you can see they actually, it's hard to see on that graphic given the scale, but New Jersey actually has a very low probability projection out at the year 2100 that actually is at plus 10 feet, similar to what Dr. Austermann was showing earlier. So there is a huge amount of uncertainty there. And not only is there uncertainty in terms of what the future sea level holds, but just in terms of how sea level acts on a day-to-day, month-to-month, and year-to-year basis. Next slide, please, Danielle. So this graphic is showing those same three projections of the curve, of the Corps curves, the red line, the green line, and the blue line, the high, intermediate, and low. And also shown on this are the measured sea level at the battery over these last about 22 years. So that's actually on a monthly average basis. Sea level is measured actually on an hour-to-hour basis every day. So each of the data points that you see on that squiggly line is actually a 1 month average. And you can see just how much variability there is, that you can see that over the span of just a few months, you can have sea level vary by as much as a foot. We might think that we're on the high projection or the low projection, but it actually is what projection are we on today? Or more importantly, what projection will we be on when that storm is bearing down and we need to start making decisions as whether activate the gates, whether they're storm surge gates or landside gates related to some of these shoreline-based measures that we've been considering. So there's a big amount of uncertainty associated with that. So we're trying to bracket all of those in our evaluations going forward because we don't know what the future holds. But depending on how you look at trend lines going off of that data, you could say that we were at the intermediate, the in between intermediate and the high projection, or closer to the high projection. So a lot of uncertainty there. Next slide, please. So we do have information on all the other alternatives if you'd like to find out more about them, but just to focus on the tentatively selected plan, the plan that we have basically addresses the coastal storm risk for the area shaded in green. There's actually a number of other projects that address a lot of the other areas that are shaded in red, but they don't do it to that same design level as what we're looking at currently on this study. The study includes about 80 miles of shoreline-based measures altogether, and that includes not only just the primary components, but it also components to address induced flooding, which does occur. It's the least, the alternative that has the least amount of it that has storm surge gates in it, as compared to the other alternatives, which kind of counts to its benefit. And it also is the third least, not the highest cost or even the second highest cost project, but it is still would be the largest project that the Corps of Engineers might ever recommend to Congress at a first cost that we currently have estimated at $52.7 billion, and with a overall construction duration timeline of 14 years. So it has 8 primary components, which I'll show on the next upcoming 8 slides. And there are a lot of details associated with each. And again, those details are contained within the report and the appendices on our website if you'd like to learn more. Next slide, please. So in this alternative, as well as some of the others, we do have a lot of storm surge gates in them at various locations, one of which is actually here between Brooklyn and Queens at Rockaway Inlet going into Jamaica Bay. And whenever you deal with storm surge gates, you have to look at a variety of different factors because they are kind of complex structures, because they do have the ability to close off a large water body from the storm surge going in. And in doing so, you might cause induced flooding outside of the barrier. So for that, we've done modeling. We need to do more, but we have identified those areas that might have that induced flooding. And we have also incorporated into this plan, as well as all the other plans for where they have those type of impacts, mitigation measures for dealing with those impacts. So there's basically a few components to storm surge gates. You have land-based tie-ins to high ground, which are shown in this graphic in orange. You have auxiliary gates to allow for ambient water flow during normal events. They're also referred to as environmental gates. Those are shown in green. And then in the middle, you can kind of see navigational gates that are open. And in this case, we're using or showing sector gate type structures, similar to what's been done in New Bedford and other locations in the Army Corps of Engineers projects, also recently down in New Orleans area. So behind the gates, we also have incorporated in our plan for the gates that are on larger water bodies, such as Jamaica Bay, high frequency flood risk reduction features. Those basically are features meant to address the very low-lying areas that would be flooded when the storm surge gates might not be closed because it's a more frequent storm event. And then they also have the added benefit of when the gates are closed for more severe storm events, just because those bays are so large, water can slosh around from the storm event just from that within the bay. So they protect those areas not only when the gates aren't closed, but then also when the gates are closed, just from that sloshing effect that occurred during the more severe storm events. So that's a common component. So I just, to give a general description. This applies also in a number of other locations where we have planned components with storm surge barriers, such as, next slide, please, Danielle. The component that we have for the backside of Staten Island and then the inner parts of New Jersey. It involves a storm surge gate on the mouth of the Kill-Van-Cole channel between Bayonne and Staten Island, shown in that little green box area. And then we have renderings also in our report, as well as on our website, that kind of show what those gates might look like, as well as on the mouth of the Arthur Kill channel between Staten Island and New Jersey, which is in that yellow boxed area. Now these are would be storm surge gates on main shipping channels in the port. So there's a lot of coordination that we have done and will need to continue to do with navigational interests to make sure that those are feasible. And there are also a number of risk reduction, or those high frequency flood risk reduction features, which are shown with the little dotted areas that are lying behind those storm surge gates, primarily in Hackensack Meadowlands along the Passaic River, and then in areas in Newark Bay, Arthur Kill, and the Kill-Van-Cole. And I would also point out that on our website, there's a story map that has an interactive GIS. So if you want to look at any of these features in more detail and more locally, you can zoom in there almost to the street level. So it's a really useful tool to kind of look at the plan that we have, as well as all the other plans on that story map website, GIS portal. Next slide, please, Danielle. Another big component that we have in our plan encompasses South Brooklyn and Queens, encompassing Jamaica Bay, an area that was very hard hit by Hurricane Sandy, as many people know. You can kind of see one of the renderings of what this might look like there. We have an elevated promenade. It's a preliminary layout right now. Elevation and even the type of measure and the location are all subject to change. But involves basically tying from Verrazano Narrows area down through Coney Island, across Sheepshead Bay, Garrison Creek, Floyd Bennett Field, across Jamaica Bay Inlet. You'll see that there's an induced flooding mitigation feature outlining the Breezy Point community, one area that our modeling shows that might have some induced flooding impacts from this component, and then also a reinforced dune structure running along Rockaway Peninsula to high ground near the Nassau County border. So it's about 22 miles of shoreline-based measures, and then 3 storm surge gates and a variety of other gate type structures throughout the that stretch. Next slide. Another component that we have is in downtown Manhattan. This dovetails with projects the city has been advancing in the East Side Resiliency Project, as well as the Two Bridges Project. Basically continues from there down from the Brooklyn Bridge down to the Battery, and then up the lower west side of Manhattan Island with a variety of shoreline-based measures, with a number of gate structures for pedestrian and vehicle access. Basically those little red dot areas, as well as some elevated promenades. Now the city has been also advancing designs, particularly for the financial district and seaport area. So we do need to refine this plan for what those designs have developed, as well as the Battery Park City Authority, which is moving forward on construction in their area. So that area likely will be extracted out of this project and put into our future without project condition alternative 1, as I mentioned earlier. So this involves about 6 miles of shoreline-based measures, and you can kind of see some really initial and somewhat austere renderings of what they might look like there on the right-hand side. We didn't want to presume on a particular type of measure or particular layout of the structure, but there are a lot of ways to make these structures a lot more appealing and very much more integrated within the communities and neighborhoods in which they would run. So it is what I would describe as the blank canvas on which we need to get input and are seeking feedback to try to make these as workable as possible so that we can address coastal storm risk for this flood prone area. Next slide, please. Similarly, in Jersey City, we have a project that, a component that basically dovetails with a project that New Jersey DEP has been advancing in the Hoboken area, but takes it down through Jersey City and down through around the Liberty State Park area, primarily with elevated promenades, as well as a combination of levees, as you can see, both on the left-hand side of this graphic, as well as the right-hand side, respectively. It involves about 8 miles of shoreline-based measures. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is another shoreline-based only measure that runs through East Harlem area. That involves a series of flood walls and elevated promenades. And you can also see there's also some induced flooding mitigation features there in the South Bronx area. The South Bronx, we don't have any primary components in the South Bronx, but we are going to be looking at that area pretty heavily going forward. Thankfully, the Bronx doesn't have a lot of low-lying, flood-prone, high-risk areas, but it does have some, Hunts Point notably. But there have been a lot of projects that have been done there for particular facilities in that area. So we're looking at trying to identify additional non-structural type measures that might be possible there. And you can see also on this rendering kind of what the elevated promenade might look like along the East River, as well as the Harlem River on the left-hand side and right-hand side, respectively. About 5 miles of shoreline-based measures in this component. Next slide, please. So we have 3 smaller storm surge gate type structures in Brooklyn and Queens area. This one is in Newtown Creek. This area does have an existing HTRW Superfund study that EPA Region 2 is leading. So we do need to do further coordination with EPA on their actions there, because for us to advance any civil works project, we have to have effectively a clean site to work with. So need to look at that, as well as New York City has its largest wastewater treatment plant on Newtown Creek. So one of the aspects of this plan, or this component, would be we probably would need to relocate that discharge point to be outside of the storm surge gate, so that that facility in and of itself, as along with the combined sewer flows that are in that area, don't cause flooding during storm events just from the rainfall caught into it. It's worthwhile to note that we do have costs factored into all these components for dealing with interior drainage during storm events, as our components may cause some of that to be exacerbated in some of these areas by restricting the discharge of the waters back out into the water. So this involves a selector gate type structure at the mouth of Newtown Creek, as well as about 3 miles of shoreline based only measures. And you can kind of see the rendering on the right kind of helps demonstrate that these are very much indeed initial layouts and types of measures, and that we very much will seek to relocate the flood wall so it doesn't obstruct the view quite so severely as that graphic indicates. We do think there's an error in the elevation of a revealed height of that structure, but nevertheless, the location for that is certainly needs improvement, which we gladly are looking for that type of feedback and have been during the public review period. And the public has responded very nicely, which Danielle will describe here in a couple slides. Next slide, please, Danielle. Again, another Superfund study area where we have a storm surge gate along with about 3 miles of shoreline-based tie-ins is in the Gowanus and Red Hook community in Brooklyn. Basically, a lot of flood walls, some levees, deployable gates, seawalls, along with the sector gate structure there at the mouth of the Gowanus Creek Canal. You can kind of see what one of those flood walls might look like there in the Red Hook along Coffey Street there in that rendering. Next slide, please. And so the last of the 8 primary components is a similar, another storm surge gate type structure in the Flushing Creek area in northern Queens, basically addressing the flood risk for that area shown in green, involving about 2 miles of shoreline-based measures, flood walls, elevated promenades, and seawalls, along with the vertical lift gate assumed for that area there, similar to what is existing in Stamford, Connecticut. That comprises the 8 primary components that are within the tentatively selected plan that we have right now. And we, as I mentioned, are looking at what studies we need to do to kind of advance this to get maybe some more into an actionable and more immediately constructible approach, while trying to advance some of the more complex features. So there's a pretty broad spectrum of what type of pathways we might have forward on the study, but as it is right now, we are currently approved to have the study completed in June of next year, but we think very likely that is going to be extended, but how much and how much additional money we don't know yet. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Danielle to talk about some of the public comments and other considerations that we have on the study. Thank you, Danielle.
Great. Thanks so much, Bryce. So Bryce mentioned that we have a draft report that was released for the public to review last September. So I just want to give an overview of the engagement that we've done to date, and also encourage anyone, if you're part of a community group, nonprofit, an elected official's office, anybody, Bryce and I and others from the project delivery team are more than happy to meet with your group. So just quickly, a lot of our outreach materials are posted online. So if you do want to share them, if you want sound bites of what we shared today, the public engagement materials on the website are a really good resource. Bryce and I, we've been doing a mix of Army Corps hosted meetings and stakeholder meetings like this one. We've done over 90 meetings to date. Actually, I think that's over 100 meetings to date, almost 100. So again, if you're part of a group that wants to host a meeting and have Bryce and I speak at it, certainly, get in touch with us and we'd be happy to do so. So during the public comment period that again started in September and lasted about 6 months, we received about 2,600 comments. This is just a snapshot of what the comments were related to. So it told the project team what people care about the most. So you could see from the pie chart and on the left-hand side, a lot of people care about flooding, environmental impacts, environmental justice, the engineering components of the project, things like that. We'll eventually be posting all of the public comments to our website. They'll probably happen in the next few months, maybe next year. Don't have an ETA on that, but they'll eventually be on the study website. Again, just some major themes we heard, not only about flooding and things like that, but and environmental impacts, but just a call for more public engagement, especially as the study moves forward. So again, if you're part of a group that would like a brief, please let Bryce and I know. We also heard calls for better incorporation of natural and nature-based features. So that's more green and more gray. So that's something certainly that our team is looking into, and to provide more information to the public. Although, like Bryce mentioned, our feasibility report is about 4,000 pages long. It was just missing the detail that people want to see about some planned components and some analyses. So that's something that our project team is currently working on to flesh out. I mentioned at the top, and Bryce also mentioned, this study has been going on since 2016, and we're scheduled to complete the study next year. And you'll see there's an asterisk next to those dates. Like Bryce mentioned, that's something that the Army Corps team and our sponsors are currently coordinating with our higher headquarters to see if that date will move. If it will move into the future. So there's no way that the study will be completed sooner. It will be completed later than the state. So again, opportunity for public engagement and more meetings if you and your groups are interested. So again, this is what the study team is currently working on. We're reviewing the comments that we received. I think we've reviewed them all at this point, but we're just kind of trying to prioritize which ones, or identify which ones require more information, more analysis, perhaps. We're looking to confirm the plan selection, so alternative 3B, and looking into refining the details of that plan. Again, this is in coordination with our sponsors, with the public, and with our higher headquarters. So again, lots going on in the study. This is a very exciting time, and there's a lot more to come. So I hope you plug into the study process. I hope you get in touch with us if you're interested in learning more. Here's our website again, And the story map that Bryce mentioned, this is a very great interactive tool. If you're a visual learner, there are lots of summaries, slider maps, renderings, graphics, things like that. So check it out if you want. And I will end now. I just want to thank everyone. I know we went over our time a little bit. You could tell Bryce and I are very excited about the study that we work on. So I appreciate the time you gave us tonight to present about this study. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Bryce. We appreciate it. Let's just jump right to questions.
Yes, so I will kind of kick off the Q&A session. Hi, everyone. I'm Faith. I'm the co-chair of the chapter with Paul. And I think I'll start by posing a question. I think I'll pose it to you, Danielle, and Bryce, as well as Dr. Austermann. Juan asks, is there a global temperature that's being considered on projections, or is there, maybe a local temperature for New York City specifically?
I can, I don't know the answer exactly, but I can give a range that I think will probably capture what's been used. So generally on the low emission end, we're looking at sort of 0.5 degree of Celsius above current temperatures. And then on the high emission, we will probably look at 3, maybe slightly more degrees. So this is by the end of the century of Celsius by the end of the century. These would be global mean temperatures. I don't know how different this would be in New York from the global mean, but that's sort of, I think, the range that's generally captured in those scenarios. Danielle and Bryce, correct me if that's wrong.
I don't know, Danielle, if you'd like to respond on this, but we do have a dedicated scientific office in our Institute for Water Resources that kind of tracks and gets into the details of it. And we kind of deal with the projections that they develop for us at the district level. So I really can't speak to it so much. Dr. Austermann probably knows that far better than I do. But certainly there are projections for it. We're kind of at unfortunately, having to deal with the results of further climate change and sea level rise in terms of how we deal with coastal storm risk, and to the extent that we may support on a personal level. Our agency is kind of we try to track what the science is telling us as coordinated through that research office that I mentioned, and hope that civilization is able to kind of get it under control a bit from what some of the projections are showing. Just because you look at a 10-foot increase in sea level rise by the end of the century, it's a daunting challenge, not just, of course, for this area, but for the nation and the world overall. So, sorry I can't be more specific in our response. Danielle, do you have anything you'd like to add? Okay.
Thank you for that. Yeah, definitely a daunting prospect. So we're doing all we can to make sure that doesn't happen. Another question for you, Dr. Austermann. Paul asks if there's a possibility of a hurricane stalling over the city and kind of creating these rain bombs that we've seen happen in Houston. And if that did happen, could that cause flooding in unexpected areas that are low lying in the city?
Yeah, that's a good question. I saw the question in the channel. I'm not sure I have an answer there. I don't know, Cherry, if you have thoughts on this just from past experiences, what the city has experienced or is planning for. But it is definitely true, and Cherry mentioned this in her presentation as well, that during the storm event, there's this rising sea level, but the rain side of it is also an important one to consider. But I don't know if there are specific areas in the city that would be particularly vulnerable, fortunately. I don't know, Cherry, do you have a thought on
Yeah, the city released stormwater maps maybe like 2.5 years ago. We call those like cloudburst situations where like in a short period of time, similar to what happened with Ida, there was like the skies just opened up and water was just like large amounts of rain was dumped onto the city. depending on where you are, you don't get, you experience it very differently. You receive a certain amount of water, and it also has to do with the drainage system itself. And so we have those maps on our website if you are interested in looking about that. So you know, tied to that is that we have lots of initiatives to deal with stormwater management.
Awesome, thank you. And I'll post this to Danielle, Bryce, and Cherry as well. Is there a map or a report that shows all of the various mitigation projects with the different areas that they're going to protect, or are they broken out in a certain way by borough, or, you know, wondering if there's just a larger map?
Yeah, there are, we do have materials on our website, and thank you, Bryce, for putting the website in the chat. I would suggest clicking on the link to the story map that is on our website, and there are static maps and interactive maps of the proposed plan. They're also in the draft integrated feasibility report that you could find on the left-hand side of the website, but I really suggest going to the story map just because there are many more maps on that resource.
Great, thank you. And Francesca asked a really good question that I'm also curious about, since I've been taking the MTA since I was 10. What about protecting the subways and subway entrances? I think we've all seen those videos or been caught in moments where there's heavy rain and it's flooding in the subway. So what kind of protective measures are we taking for the subway?
So Bryce and I can speak about HATS and what that plan is proposing. I don't know, Cherry, if you have information about the city or the MTA's work on that end. But I'll start just generally, you know, a lot of what we're proposing through the HATS project is reducing risk to flood-prone areas just generally. So the infrastructure within those areas, whether it be subways or buildings, you know, the homes that we live in. We're not proposing anything specific on the subway infrastructure. So things like you might see in flood-prone areas like Lower Manhattan, like flood-proofing or deployable covers or anything like that. We're basically proposing things that can help entire communities. With that being said, we've been coordinating with the MTA to learn more about their needs and their ongoing projects. So that's certainly something we could look more into as we connect again with the MTA throughout the project phases, just to see if there's some way that the Army Corps and the HATS project can plug into what the MTA is perhaps planning or the problems that they see.
I can't speak for the MTA, they're a state authority, but I do know that after Sandy, they had done some upgrades to some of their rail yards and bus depots, right? With a future planning in mind, future risk in mind. I know that they've like internally staffed up a lot, and they're evaluating it now, how to integrate you know, climate risk into their capital planning. So yeah, I think to Danielle's point, you know, they are thinking about like on an asset to asset basis, like how to harden those pieces, you know, for these, like not just stormwater, but also coastal flooding and heat.
Yeah, that's an excellent example of critical infrastructure like that, where I mentioned earlier that we have a framework of a plan, and we're looking to develop it and refine it and expand upon it. One of those being non-structural measures. So looking at critical infrastructure like the facilities that the MTA has that haven't been addressed, that are in fairly high-risk flood-prone areas, as well as other critical infrastructure throughout the city and study area, are excellent examples of where we might look to try to identify additional non-structural type approaches for doing flood proofing for those areas. But there's a lot more coordination, as Danielle mentioned, that we need to do on that front going forward in the study. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then a question for you, Danielle and Bryce. Paul asks, where will all of the water go that is redirected? Could it inundate river towns on the Hudson or Nassau County shoreline, or was that included in the study?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Before, I'm going to turn it over to you, Bryce, because you know the technical details better than I do. But I just want to say that if you look at the materials online, if you're interested in this concept, the Army Corps calls it induced flooding. And that's all I'll say before I pass it over to Bryce for the explanation.
Sure. Thank you, Danielle. There is an appendix that actually speaks to that, the AdCirc modeling. It's in the engineering appendix, and there are components that are included in all the plans for the area where that model indicates that there might be that diverted type flood impact, where the flood waters, which might be otherwise, say, 16 feet, might be 16 and a half or 17 feet. We include mitigation measures for dealing with that 16 and a half or 17 feet of water in those areas, which otherwise may not have gotten any kind of flood risk management in them. Now, the alternative that we have, and the components that do that, or the measures that do that most frequently, are storm surge gates, particularly if they're on large water bodies, because they're blocking such a big area that might otherwise absorb storm surge, so that impact elsewhere. That being said, that there are a lot of tidal straits within the harbor and large tributaries like the Hudson. So there are a lot of pathways for water to dissipate too. So the alternative that we selected actually has the least amount of induced flooding for the alternatives that have storm surge gates in them. And that was one reason why that alternative kind of stood out from the rest. Not just from economics, but it had the least amount of induced flooding. And for those areas that do have induced flooding, as our modeling indicates, we have and will propose doing mitigation measures for dealing with that induced flooding for those neighborhoods. So that's a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then another question for you, Bryce and Danielle. Dr. Austermann has a question. Were approaches of resettling, like the voluntary program that Cherry touched on, considered in your alternatives?
That's also another non-structural type measure. Currently, the approach that we've taken on the study, formulation-wise, has been primarily looking at the large impacts, because those have generally the largest damages, as we saw with the, what was it, $50 billion of damage from Hurricane Sandy overnight, and unfortunately so many number of lives lost. So the health safety risk from the severe storm events really has been our primary focus. And to that end, since storm surge gates themselves have the potential for addressing such large, vast stretches of shoreline, but they do come at a very high cost and have a high complexity in terms of their environmental evaluation and their engineering. We did kind of focus on that severe storm event and looking at more of the structural type measures as our first screen of evaluation. And that's why I described the plan that we have as a framework. We do indeed plan on looking at non-structural measures going forward, not just for the critical infrastructure, as I mentioned, flood-proofing type approaches, but also relocations, home elevations, and other areas where we might feasibly try to deal with storm risk where we don't currently have any addressed measures or approaches laid out. So for the amount of area that we do address in our current plan, which is about 63%, that still leaves a lot of area. And then, of course, there's a number of areas where, storm surge isn't necessarily bad. A lot of the natural areas along the Hudson River and things like that. And so, it's trying to balance and trade off how best to address coastal storm risk, given the diversity of the area, both in terms of the population, the infrastructure density, and the natural resources as well, of course. Great question.
Amazing, thank you. Question that I'll post to you all so you can inform us, but when can some of the plans start being used for real projects that we talked about here today?
I'm not sure I understand your question. When would the projects be that the Corps has identified be potentially constructed? Is that what you mean, or
Yes.
done?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think just and I know that, you know, these things take time to come to fruition. But you know, when do they start, you know, from the things that we've kind of seen today, some of the things that we've seen, what are some of the next steps to kind of take them through so that they actually start, you know, being implemented and constructed?
Okay. I don't know, Danielle, if you'd want to respond, but just to give a little bit broader picture, we've been talking about the schedule that we have for our study. So a core civil works project, it starts with a feasibility study, and that study ends with the chief's report, which is our recommendation to Congress for what we think is the solution to the problem that's been identified to us by our non-federal partners, the city in this case, for example. So that's been primarily coastal storm risk, but there are a number of other areas where we might look into fluvial type rainfall, flooding events, things of that nature, and the joint probability of coastal storms and fluvial events occurring at the same time. There's a lot of things left to be evaluated, but the study ends with the chief's report that goes to Congress, and then it's in their hands to decide whether to give the Corps of Engineers authorization to proceed. And it's described as construction authorization. And so once that's done, then we don't necessarily jump straight into construction. There's usually a lot of still pre-construction engineering and design work that needs to be done. And whether that takes a couple of years for the more actionable and more easily implemented components that we have, versus taking maybe 5 or 10 years for the more complex components, particularly some of those larger storm surge gate type structures I showed, is something that we have to kind of work out. Because right now we're looking at how much more study do we want to do versus, you know, that design phase following. So the more we do in study, then maybe less in design. But in our current plan, we had our recommendation being done in 2024. As Danielle mentioned, and I think I mentioned also, that is likely to get extended out. But we assumed a 6-year design phase following the study, and assuming that we would get construction authorization relatively soon after the study from Congress. Again, that's an uncertainty. We don't know on that, but we have assumed it. And then after that 6 years of design, the plan, assuming we have unconstrained federal and non-federal funding, we think would take about 14 years to fully construct all of it. Now that's somewhat idealized in terms of the availability of funding, the quick authorization by Congress, and there are a number of other factors like the cleanup of some of those HTRW sites by other agencies, and a huge laundry list of issues and details to work out. But that's the general time frame. So some components, if we extend the study, might just have a couple of years. And if we extend the study, it might be a 2026, maybe it's 2028 time period. And maybe there's a couple of years of design phase falling for those more easily actionable components, but then longer still. So we're looking at a probably at the very earliest for the more simple components, 2035 from when the construction could be completed. I know that sounds a long year, quite a few years away, and it certainly is. To the extent that we can accelerate it, we'd love to. And then some of the more complex components, maybe it's more of a 2045 or 2050 by the time they're completed. But, you know, to use the saying, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Thankfully, we're not at the first step, but we're certainly not at the end of that journey by a long way. So a lot more work left to be done.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we're definitely looking forward to it. So we know it takes time. And I know we're coming up to time. We had so many great questions, but I wanted to pose one last one that I would love everyone to weigh in on. So Katie asks, given how much time you spend on, you know, this specific topic when it comes to sea level rise and all the data that you all are intaking, if you had a magic megaphone and could say one thing to all the residents of New York, what would you say? You know, whether it's, you know, things we could do to help out, feedback we could give, something you wish everyone knew, what would you kind of say to the residents? So I'll start with you, Cherry.
Do your part in reducing your carbon emissions, like ride the subway.
Definitely do that all the time. So I'm glad I'm taking that one off. What about you, Dr. Austermann? What would you tell people?
Yeah, this is very more on the scientific than the action side, but on a more global scale. But what I generally emphasize and try to convey is that sea level change isn't equal to sea level change. And Bryce, I love the figure that you had as well, with even like the monthly means changing so much, and from one location to the next, it's going to be drastically different. So when thinking about this problem on a global scale, the changes are going to be very different, and in some places sea level is going to fall dramatically in the next century. So it's going to we're going to require a big portfolio of beyond New York City of strategies to deal with future sea level change.
Thank you. Bryce, what would you share?
I think I've been talking too much as it is. I'd let Danielle, if she wants to, please make the suggestion.
If I had a microphone, I would use it to tell people to vote and get involved. Maybe that's me sitting at a federal agency. Our federal elected officials, also at the state and local level, are very responsive to their constituents. The HAT study is only being done because Congress told Bryce and I and our agency to start it. We're only working on it because people voted and their elected officials told the Army Corps to start the project. So I would just, I would say vote. I would say get involved. It's forums like this that are really great to exchange information and just get new ideas out there. So that's what I would use for my soapbox moment if I had one.
Great, thank you. Yes, voting is super, super important. Well, I wanted to just thank you all. Thank you, Danielle, Bryce, Dr. Austermann, and Cherry for sharing all your wisdom tonight. I think we all learned a lot and probably have some more questions brewing. But we really appreciate you all being here, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you at our next chapter meeting. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.